Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for your patience. We are so glad to have you here tonight on facebook.com/Pearl News. My name is Tracy McPeck. I'm the Adult Services Coordinator for Central Rappahannock Regional Library. This is our first in a year-long lecture series celebrating 300 years of Spotsylvania County history. You can join us on the first Thursday of every month throughout 2021 right here on Facebook Live. For more information on the Spotsylvania Tricentennial, including additional events, visit spotsylvania.va.us or follow Visit Spotsy on Facebook. Tonight's lecture features Ms. Ashley Abruzzo and Dr. Eric Larsen of the Germana Foundation. Ms. Abruzzo joined the foundation team in February 2017 as its new membership development manager. Ms. Abruzzo grew up in Rockford, Illinois, and received her BA in History from the University of Illinois at Springfield and her MA in Applied History from Shippensburg University of Pennsylvania. Ms. Abruzzo is a Germana descendant through the Krigler and Clore families that were a part of the 1717 Germana colony. She has presented on Germana throughout Virginia and Maryland and looks forward to her first virtual presentation. Let's try not to give her too hard of a time. Dr. Eric Larsen brings more than 25 years of archaeological experience to his position as the archaeologist of the Germana Foundation. He has worked with the National Park Service at Harpers Ferry National Historical Park and for the University of Maryland on sites in Annapolis, Maryland. He directed field work at the Freedmen's and Contraband Cemetery for the city of Alexandria, Virginia, and assisted with excavations at George Washington's boyhood home at Ferry Farm for the George Washington Foundation. He has taught introductory archaeology classes and trained numerous students through a variety of field schools around the mid-Atlantic states. The first to present will be Ms. Abruzzo, and then Dr. Larsen will present shortly thereafter. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the Facebook comments, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A after both Dr. Larsen and Ms. Abruzzo speak. Okay, so Ashley, I'm going to remove Eric and myself from the stream and turn it over to you.
Perfect. Now I'm going to make sure my PowerPoint shows up here. All right. All right. Well, thank you all again for being here tonight. I'm excited to be presenting with my first virtual presentation. And I also want to make a quick note of how excited that Germana has been to be a part of the Spotsylvania 300th anniversary planning and also the events in the past couple months. And we look forward to the upcoming events throughout the rest of the year. And my portion of the presentation is called The Birth of Spotsylvania County, the Germana Settlers. And I'll be discussing a little bit about the history of the Germana settlers. And before we get into that, I want to talk about the origins of the Germana Foundation, as I'm sure there might be a few of you out there who are not familiar with us. So the genesis of the Germana Foundation began in the 1940s when a descendant named Archibald Martin began gathering Germana descendants and Spotswood descendants for picnics at the location of where the Fort Germana Visitor Center is today. In the 1950s, a gentleman named Ernst Flender, who was a Ziegen immigrant living in New York, received a newspaper clipping from his sister, who lived in Germany still, from Dr. Charles Huffman, who was with the Society of Germana in 1954, and discussed the reconciliation of Germany and America after World War II. And Ernst Flender was so moved by it that they met, and eventually he gave oil stock in 1956 to buy 270 acres of the original property that the Germana settlement was originally on. And our mission statement is the Germana Foundation tells America's history and story of liberty through the frontier experience of her settlers and descendants using archaeological, historical, and genealogical research and interpretation. And of course, many of you are familiar with Germana Community College. In 1969, the foundation actually donated land to the Commonwealth of Virginia to establish a new community college system. And that system, or that college, was eventually called Germana Community College. And so the Locust Grove campus is actually right next to the Fort Germana Visitor Center. So we're going to begin in the 1700s with Queen Anne of Great Britain, who is in reign from 1702 to 1714. And between 1708 and '09, she encouraged Germans along the Rhine River to come to London and then eventually go to the colonies where they would receive land. And during this time, there were Virginia planters, William Byrd and Robert King Carter, who were interested in mining adventures, whether it be gold, copper, lead, iron. And there were already mining operations underway in North Carolina, essentially run by a man named Baron de Graffenried, who was from Bern, Switzerland, and he established New Bern, North Carolina. He would have a mining operation going in New Bern. There were Tuscarora Indians around there at the time, so that operation didn't go very far. But he did meet with a certain Alexander Spotswood, and we're going to talk about him next. So Alexander Spotswood was Lieutenant Governor of Virginia from 1710 to 1722. And he was born in Tangier, Morocco in 1676. He was the son of a British Army surgeon and was of Scottish descent. As he got older, he served in the British Army under the Duke of Marlborough as a quartermaster. And once he arrived in Virginia, he was very instrumental in several of the buildings that you see in Williamsburg. Originally, it was the Governor's Palace, the Powder Magazine, and Bruton Parish Church. And by his first full year in the colonies, miners from Germany in the Siegen area were very interested in making their way over to the colonies to assist with any mining recruitment. And so we see in 1714 the first group of Germans to arrive in Virginia to help Spotswood with his imperial and personal ambitions. So we're first going to talk about the first Germana colony and the establishment of Fort Germanna. Now, the first group to arrive from Germany came from the Siegen area. It was an iron center where they had smelting and iron mining from the Celtic times. And even today, you can still see some of the small mines that dot the hillside. And this portion of Germany specifically was and is very heavily forested, to the extent that even today they manage an 18-year rotation system called the Harburg to help produce wood and make charcoal. And several of the families that came to Virginia came from villages in Siegen that were called Trupbach, Oberfischbach, Oberschelden, Niederndorf, Meusen, Eisern, Freudenberg, and Kahn-Marienborn. So a little bit of the background on the first colony. They were comprised of 42 men, women, and children, and they arrived in the spring of 1714. Now, their arrival was a little interesting as they were initially meant to be sponsored with passage to the colonies. However, that fell through, and so they had to figure out a way to arrange passage to Virginia. They ended up pooling their money together to afford passage and eventually became indentured to Spotswood, meaning they would have to work out the remaining of their time for repayment, and were indentured to him for 4 years. Now, prior to their arrival, Spotswood had appropriated a fort to be built. Essentially, this would be protection against the French and any Native Americans in the area. And he also had it strategically placed in an area where he had hoped to find iron and silver. And within this fort was a blockhouse that would become the first German Reformed congregation in Virginia. And we have one person to thank for the only description that is known of the fort. John Fontaine was a British soldier. He visited the Fort Germanna site a couple times, and he mentioned how it was a pentagon shape. It was 5-sided, it had the blockhouse, and they used it for divine service. It was also 300 feet on all 5 sides. It had 9 homes built in a line. They had sheds for hogs, and the Germans lived very miserably. Imagine leaving Germany, your half-timbered homes that you can still see today, and arriving in Virginia, living in a much smaller building that they were probably not used to. And because of Fontaine's diary entry, we have a mock-up of what we think the fort may have looked like. This is a rendering of the fort. You'll see we have the blockhouse in the middle with the 9 homes. We have the sties in the back. And Dr. Larsen will talk a little bit more about this during his presentation. So these are the 1714 family surnames. Again, you have 42 men, women, and children who arrived in 1714, and they were comprised of 9 families. So you have names such as Fishback, Hager, Hitt, Holtzclaw, Martin, Utterback, Spielman, Rector, Weaver. Now, this first group will eventually move away from the Fort Germanna site. They will move to Fauquier County and establish Germantown. And the map you see is essentially how the plots were lined up. And today, if you were to visit this area in Fauquier County, unfortunately, the majority of it is underwater. It's where Crockett Park is located. There's Germantown Lake, and the majority of the land that the first colony would settle after their time at Fort Germanna is unfortunately underwater. And eventually in the 1730s, there was another wave of families related to this first colony that would move and settle in modern day northern Culpeper County. So now we introduce the second Germanna colony, whose circumstances were a bit different than the first colony. Now, these families were from the area in Germany called Baden-Württemberg, and it was 80 plus Germans that made up this group, families, men, women, and children. Essentially, they were going to London to seek passage to Pennsylvania. William Penn was sending out pamphlets and painting a rosy picture of what life would be like in Pennsylvania, and the landscape in Pennsylvania was very similar to the landscape that these German groups were used to in their region of Germany. And once they arrived in London, they met with Captain Tarbot to take them to Pennsylvania. However, Tarbot was a gambler, and he ended up in debtor's prison for several months. Enough time would pass that this group would no longer have the funds to make their way to Pennsylvania. And Tarbot, knowing Spotswood, he decided that he would hijack this group of Germans and bring them to Virginia instead. So just like the first group, they were indentured. However, this group was indentured for 7 years. And as you saw just a minute ago, the fort itself was not very big. You didn't have a lot of room for additional homes. And so these Germans would actually settle on the western portion of the Rapidan River. If you were to visit there today, it's essentially in present-day Culpeper County. And these men and women had trades and backgrounds that were farmers, craftsmen, winemakers, a completely different background than what the first group was used to. And by the end of their servitude, many of the colonists were sued by Spotswood. We're not really sure the real reason why. There's a very good chance that these colonists were sued by Spotswood because they didn't finish their servitude. However, all the court cases were dropped, and eventually they would move onward. So this is a look at some of the surnames from the first colony. Some of them are pretty common you see around this area today. Blake and Baker, Clore, Krigler, Holt, Jaeger, Kiefer, and Cook. And we do have a list of these names on our website, germanna.org. So if anybody sees surnames that look familiar and you want more information, definitely visit us at our website. And this is another section of the second colony group. So you have Milliker, Moyer, Roop, Schlechter, Schneider, Utz, Weaver, and Zimmerman. Now, as I mentioned, this second group would eventually move out of the area and they would settle in modern-day Madison County along the Robinson River Valley. And this map actually shows a lot of the land patents of where the families were. And they received 300 to 400 acres of land and would essentially establish Hebron Lutheran Church, which is the oldest and continuous Lutheran church in America today. And just kind of a timeline summary, because I know there were a lot of dates and names thrown at you. 1714, the first colony arrives from Siegen and arrives at Fort Germanna. And the name Germanna actually comes from a combination of the Germans that settled there and Queen Anne of Great Britain. The second colony will arrive in 1717 from the Baden-Württemberg area and settle on the Rapidan River on the west side. The first colony eventually moves to Fauquier County, and once that happens, this is when Spotswood begins to do the creation of the Enchanted Castle. So the fort will come down around 1719, 1720, and his home, which William Byrd nicknamed, would be established around 1720. So imagine taking the governor's palace in Williamsburg and bringing it all the way out here along present-day Route 3. That is kind of what it would have looked like. Now, 1720 is when the formation of Spotsylvania County was announced, and in May 1st, 1721 is when the county boundaries would have been established. And by the following year, in 1722, Germanna is established as the first county seat, and then the second colony will move out by 1724, 1725. So it's also important to note that if you're doing research on families, to take note of the different county changes. The first colony would not have been here when Spotsylvania County was established. However, the second colony would have been here for a few years. And within that boundary of Germanna being the county seat, you would have had a courthouse and a jail and more being set up. And this is just a brief history of Germanna. There's a lot more to learn at the Visitor Center, and Dr. Eric Larsen will present next, and he has really cool information on the area that would become known as the town of Germanna and more archaeology. So I'm going to send it over to Eric now. Thank you so much.
Well, hopefully I'm on. It's good evening to everybody. I'm very excited to have this opportunity to talk about Spotsylvania County. We are neighbors in a way, but we're also kind of connected. There's an origin story that has been rather fascinating to discover as I've started to learn about and dig into the archaeology of Germanna. So this is a wonderful opportunity. I'm really glad you've invited us to be able to share this. I hope you find it of interest, and I'm also hoping to introduce you to a long-term ongoing project. So maybe if you're interested, you can keep an eye out for it, because we're hoping to learn more about sort of this origin story over years to come as we dig in new places and learn more about the historic Germanna town. All right, so let's see, you're going with my first slide. Let's sort of locate ourselves. So Germanna itself is right along the Rapidan River, and I've got there we go. I've got a little bit of an arrow there kind of pointing to where it is. It's on a little small peninsula within the river, about halfway between Culpeper and Fredericksburg.
Dr. Larsen, can I interrupt you?
Yes.
We actually cannot see your screen right now.
You can't?
No.
Okay, let me get back here. I apologize.
That's okay. I'll take myself out, and then once I see I can put it in, I'll do that.
Okay, am I getting in now?
You are not. You could, oh, it's coming up.
Okay, great.
Okay, here we go.
Sorry about that. All right, so here's my map. We were sort of looking, there is where this peninsula is. Again, it's kind of about halfway between Culpeper and Fredericksburg. Let me get my laser. There we go. We're all set now. That's just where we're located. Again, Ashley sort of gave you an introduction, a common person in this story of sort of the first settlers and the beginnings of Spotsylvania County all sort of hinge around Alexander Spotswood. Again, he was lieutenant governor of the colony of Virginia from 1710 to 1722 when he was ousted. He then made a choice to continue to live in the colony of Virginia, and he settled on the land there at Germanna. And we'll talk a little bit more about detail about that as he sort of was instrumental in sort of the early years of Spotsylvania County. All right, so here's how I got into this question. In the late 60s and early 70s, local historians and avocational archaeologists were interested in finding where Spotswood's Enchanted Castle once was. They knew it was along the Rapidan. They knew it was an area around called near the Germanna Ford. We knew where those places were, but the specific location of the house wasn't yet known. So they did some research and they did some testing, and they actually began to figure out where they believed the house once sat. In the 70s, the state came in and confirmed that. They tested and found some of the foundations for the house, Spotswood's mansion, and everything was great. We knew where it was. They actually listed it on the National Register, and everybody was rather excited by that. Everything was fine until the site became threatened by a development, land development in the area. They wanted to develop into some housing estates, smaller estates, and that would have impacted the archaeological site in itself. So some salvage work was done to try and define and learn as much as they could about it before it may have been impacted. And what the archaeologists began to do is they uncovered the outline of the building. And this is an overhead view of what they found. Let me help outline it a little bit. This area here is the main house itself. It's large. It's about 40 feet across and about 90 feet wide. And then they found two buildings, dependencies adjacent to that. So there's one over here in this area. That's to the west. And it's connected by a covered walkway called a hyphen. And then a third building, a smaller one here, the southwest dependency, also covered, connected by a hyphen, by a covered walkway. And because Spotswood was an advocate for this new Georgian style of architecture, Georgian style is always based on symmetry. So the idea was that there was probably equal buildings, another outbuilding over here and here, connected by hyphens. Now they did testing for that, and there is signs that there were continuations of the building off in this direction. But because of a later development in this area of the property, the Gordon Farmstead, which was around from the 1790s through the 1880s, they think some of the materials that had once been used for the Enchanted Castle were robbed out and then used in that later farmhouse, which makes very, very good sense to reuse materials like that way. But what it ends up doing is it ends up creating this sort of U-shaped complex of interconnected buildings. And this collectively was known as the Enchanted Castle. Because of its largeness and significance, the developer allowed Historic Gordonsville Incorporated to purchase the 5 lots that would have been subdivided the property. And they were able to save the property and the structure at that point, and the ruins at that point. They invited scholars to come in and to work on the site. Mary Washington College took over the site, the stewardship of the site largely for about a 10-year period, and they ran archaeological field schools each summer for about over that 10-year period. Unfortunately, they ran out of funding in 1995, and the site kind of sat empty for a 20-year period until the foundation asked if they could sort of step in and take over stewardship and maybe restart a new archaeology program. They did that in 2015 or 2014. They hired me at the end of 2014, and we've sort of been building a brand new program and trying to restart archaeology out at the Enchanted Castle site, but we're also looking more. We're looking at sort of the larger landscape now. So here again, this is just sort of the map that they created, and here is the main building. This time we're looking at it north as at the top. When we were looking at it the last slide, this was oriented looking southwards. Now we're looking towards the top with north at the top. So here would be the main house. Here would be one of the dependencies connected with a hyphen. And here's another little small single room building also connected with a hyphen. And then they would have had the mirror on the other side as well. And again, that's that U-shaped complex that I was talking about. That's what they discovered, and that's what they worked on for that 10-year period. When I got started in 2014 and beginning in 2015, I had a lot to learn. This is one of the first posters that I put together to present some of my project hopes. And I put it up here today as a reminder to me of all the things that we tried to cover in this project. First, it's a question about the frontier. And frontier is a term that I think we know a lot, or we feel very easy with it. It's, it brings up ideas of coonskin caps and Davy Crockett running through the woods and that sort of thing. That's all, that's all kind of fun and interesting, but it doesn't necessarily directly apply when we think about Virginia. So I tried to tease out what does it mean, and we're trying to sort of come up with a more nuanced, more complex understanding of frontier. The most important thing about it, though, is I think you need to understand that frontier is very much tied to colonialism. If you are talking about going out and living on the frontier, that means you are seeing that as yourself on the edge of a larger entity, a larger body politic, a colony somewhere else. You're on the periphery for a core that is in the old world or wherever that is. If you believe that you're on the frontier, probably people that you meet around you may not have the same idea of the place that you do. They may be thinking of this as hunting grounds or of the area next to their village, that sort of thing. Frontier is a very situational based term, and it's not one that just everybody agrees to necessarily. So keep that in mind. And because of that, there's also frontiers are places where different peoples and cultures kind of come into contact with each other. And there's a little note on here. There's 4 little groups of players that we talk about a lot at Germana, with the Germana Foundation. We're growing more and more interested in the movement and migrations of people, and the frontier is a wonderful place. It's a wonderful laboratory to talk about this. And the different players that we have at play at Germana are the Native Americans. The Manahoac were known to live in this area when John Smith was traversing the Chesapeake Bay and going up the rivers. He would go up as far as to the fall line. So that on the Rappahannock, when he went up the Rappahannock, he got to close to the area around Fredericksburg before he couldn't go any further upriver because it wouldn't allow, the boats wouldn't go up the falls. The falls blocked his passage. So he asked about it, and he learned that the Manahoac lived in this area, and he documented that, and we learned about that from him. So the Native Americans are an important group of people that we want to talk about as far as this movement. We also want to talk about the English. Of course, it was a British settlement. There's a movement out of Jamestown in the first 100 years of the colony out into the Piedmont area, up above the fall line. That's another set of moving peoples. With Germana, as Ashley kind of sort of let you know, there's a real interest in these German migrants, this migration from Germany to London and then making their way all the way here to the Virginia periphery. That's another fascinating story. But there's one more group of people that are part of this story as well, and that is the forced migrations, the enslaved Africans that were brought in for labor and helping build the beginnings of Germana out there as well. So those are the people that come to play in this. We talk about the fort. That was the first architecture. That was the first settlement of the place. And that's something that we're trying to learn more about, just to kind of help set the scene. I've talked briefly, and then I'll bring it up again. The fort was the location of the jumping off point for Spotswood's Knights of the Golden Horseshoe expedition. And I don't know if everybody's familiar with that. It was something that I needed to learn, but that's also sort of fascinating. And then after that, Spotswood started to gather land around the Germanna area. Germanna actually then became seat of Spotsylvania County as it was first formed as the county seat. So that poster just sort of outlines those two things, and it gives a little bit of an outline of our larger project. All right, so we're curious about the fort right now. Just again, this is the beginnings of settlement in this particular area. So here's a map, and on it are listed, noted Jamestown down here, and Williamsburg up here. The area that's going to be shaded in blue now, this is largely the area of settlement. And notice how it follows the rivers. The rivers were the major mode of transportation. The James River and the York Rivers were the ones that were most densely settled in the first 100 years of Virginia as a colony. And that always fell below the fall line. Again, the fall line was a block point where you could no longer bring shipping up and down. So people tended to stay below the falls and live in that area because they were so reliant on the rivers for transportation. Well, Spotswood entered the colony in 1710, and he felt a need to push for expansion, and he also felt that there was a need for defense. Spotswood actually mentioned that he was coming. He had, been at the Battle of Blenheim with the Duke of Marlborough. He had been the engineer for that group and had been responsible for moving tens of thousands of soldiers, making sure that the bridges were in place and lining up the campsites for them. He had a lot of responsibility. Well, he came to Virginia with that mindset, and his concern is that the French were out there in the New World, in the Americas. French being the enemy in the old world that he had fought, he brought that enemy and realized that they were a threat here in the New World as well. So he proposed looking to the mountains. His hope is to use the mountains as a natural barrier, but Virginia was not close to the mountains yet. Virginia needed to sort of venture out. So he proposed two forts. First, he set one along the next river north of the major settlement, and that's the Rappahannock River. And he also sent one to the river to the south of most of the settlement, the Heron River. And he proposed to put two forts along those. The one to the south is called Fort Christiana. That's in Brunswick County currently today. And to the north, he built Fort Germanna. And these two forts were supposed to be part of a system, again, to keep the French at bay. The race in Spotswood's mind, I think, was to get to the Blue Ridge Mountains because that was a naturally defensive spot. But this was sort of an interim defense that would serve as a barrier should the French start to make a move towards Virginia. Now, when I say French, there was also the Indians that treated with the French. And so the Native Americans could also be a hostile proxy for the French. But all of this was in Spotswood's military mind and was behind his sort of setting up this fort system. Right. Ashley gave you a little bit of a story about how we know about the fort as it was built in 1714. Again, it's from the Journal of John Fontaine. I'm not going to read it through it again, but I actually kind of am really thrilled with Fontaine. He takes two paragraphs and he gives us a whole lot of information. He describes the physical boundaries of the fort, the wooden curtain wall. He describes how many houses or dwellings are within it. He describes the central blockhouse. He gives us a lot of details, which is really helpful for us or me as an archaeologist trying to sort of relocate this structure. He gives us insight into sort of how it was laid out and what we can look for or what we can expect. But he also gives us a little bit of insight into the community that's in there. I kind of love the fact that he mentions that they make use of the blockhouse for divine service. They go to prayers constantly, once a day and twice on Sundays. He's kind of described the physical layout, but he's also sort of letting us know about that there's a community in these Germans families living inside of this fort. So it's a rather insightful, small piece of documentation that he gives us. All right, I mentioned before that Fort Germana was used as the jumping off point for Alexander Spotswood's Knights of the Golden Horseshoe expedition. I had to find some way to put Spotswood on a horse. He was definitely an adventuresome guy. He was out there. He did not just sit around in the governor's palace. He made his way. So I kind of figured out some way to bring Spotswood and move him across our scene. What's interesting, again, I said he used the fort as a jumping off point. There was a 5-day period where they grouped together at the fort, got together supplies, shoed their horses, and then then set out on their expedition. And those 5 days are described in John Fontaine's journal. Rather interesting sort of discussions about it, but it makes me think a lot about what that must have been like. So by 1716, in August of 1716, German families had lived there for about 2 years and probably had started to get a little bit of routine in life. But remember, this is on the periphery of the colony of Virginia. There's probably not a lot of activity outside of their own community. But here in these days of August of 1716, out from the roadway up towards Germanna comes several bewigged gentlemen, Spotswood included, and John Fontaine and other friends of his. Several of them came as members of this expedition. Along with the gentlemen were their servants. They could be indentured servants from the old world, or from Europe, but they also could be enslaved Africans as well. But the servants were there to sort of be part of the expedition and to help out with the labor of the expedition. In addition to these people, there were 2 companies of rangers. I imagine the rangers were somewhat different than the bewigged gentlemen. So there's different groups of people and classes that are all showing up. And then lastly, there was 4 Meherrin Indian guides that also came into the fort and met for the expedition's beginning. And this mix of cultures must have been, I don't know whether to say it was shocking or if it was exciting, like the circus had just come to town. For 5 days, all these different peoples, and again, remember this Germana project is hoping to talk about peoples coming together, meeting, and trying to figure out how things are going to work on this new settlement. All of these people met for these 5 days, and I oftentimes find myself sort of wondering what must have that been like for the families and for the other individuals who are about to set off on this expedition. They made their way out. They crossed the Blue Ridge. It's astounding when you read the amount of different types of liquors and alcohols that they brought with them in order to toast, each toast being a different beverage, to the queen, to the king, or to the queen, to the governor, to everyone else you can think of, just toast after toast after toast. There must have been a pack animal just stocked with alcohol. It must have been quite an expedition. They made their way back fine, though. Everything was very successful. All the gentlemen made it back. I think there were a few bumps and bruises along the way, but I think everyone had a good time. Spotswood is said to have commemorated their journey by giving each member a pin, a horseshoe pin, which is why we kind of come to know of it as the Knights of the Golden Horseshoe, or the Golden Horseshoe Expedition. As all these gentlemen came back, soon afterwards, they started to amass land around the areas that they had gone and explored, Spotswood included. By 1720, Spotswood had accrued 80,000 acres, ranging all the way from west of Culpeper all the way down to Massaponax. Germanna, the spot where the fort had once sat, is basically sort of a center for that place. And I think Spotswood began to think of that as the possibility of that being the center of his own operations for his estate. Shortly after this period of around 1720, Spotswood must have sort of removed at least a portion of the fort because he started to build a house for himself, this mansion. Again, this mansion is kind of on a scale similar to the governor's palace that he had built and which made such an impression on Virginians in Williamsburg, completed around 1715. He built a house probably comparable to that on the very fringes of settlement at the time, 15, 20 miles beyond anywhere else, anybody else's settlement. We are starting to learn through the archaeology that this is a remarkable structure. This is an interesting drawing. This is, again, that plan view I showed you. In the early 2000s, Dr. Carrie Briel did her dissertation on the Enchanted Castle, and she created sort of a 2D rendering to look at it from the front. Well, one of our staff members a few years ago, Dr. Mark Trickett, took both of these things, and because technology has changed so much, he was able to sort of put together this three-dimensional mock-up. And it's helping us sort of get a better understanding of what this house may have been. And it is a substantial home. I think even today, when you stand out at the site, the ruins are gone. It's hard to see, but we've tried to mark out the size of the building. If you stand there with this image nearby and looking at the ground that we've marked, you start to get a sense that this was a rather large building. Put that out on Virginia's frontier, and it brings up a lot of questions. All right. So real briefly, let me try and give you a timeline that really sticks with Spotsylvania. Spotswood starts to build this Enchanted Castle around 1720 for himself. 1720, 1721, Spotsylvania County is organized, from the council and the burgesses level, and they choose to these are opportunities. There are two counties that are actually formed. These are opportunities to allow for westward movement. They want to honor Spotswood because he's been so fundamental in creating this fort system and advocating for expansion. They honor him by putting his namesake on the county, Spotswood, Spotsylvania counties. The Sylvania is kind of a term for wood, so it's kind of Spotswood County in a lot of ways. Kind of an honorific for him. At the same time that Spotsylvania County is organized, St. George's Parish, remember that the Church of England and the government are very much intertwined at the time. St. George's Parish is organized along with the county at that time. In 1722, just a couple years later, the first court session is held at Germanna. There's some sort of murmurings that it really wasn't in a finished courthouse, that Spotswood allowed portions of the court to use his personal home, the portions of the Enchanted Castle. There kind of continues to be murmurings about Spotswood and his relationship with the town. But they do begin their court sessions at that time. Around 1724, a couple years later, again, there's murmurings about this. There's a little disappointment about, one, having the church so far out west that it's difficult to go and visit, and two, Spotswood seems to be sort of taking a long time to get the church constructed. All these sort of murmurings, and then there's a lot of questions that people brought up about how did Spotswood accrue this 80,000 acres. Well, Spotswood makes a decision that he needs to go to London to sort of settle this matter once and for all. So he leaves in 1724, returns 5 years later from London, having settled the issue. He paid some of his back rents or quit rents and took care of the business that he needed to, and convinced that everything was fine. He returns from London, but he also marries Butler Brain while he's there, and has two children during that time period. Two of the four children that he had came with him and returned, and they went right back to Germana to live there at the Enchanted Castle again. In 1730, the parish is reorganized with the western land, so the Wilderness Run and beyond becoming part of St. Mark's Parish. The Germanna Church, Fort Church, and Mountain Churches all become part of this new parish. And then William Byrd, who was visiting Spotswood. Spotswood has created his iron furnace. I'm running out of time, so I can't talk about that too much, but I understand where there's going to be a future lecture about the mining in the area, so that's great. Spotswood is sort of talking to William Byrd in the Enchanted Castle in his home about what he'd learned about this iron industry, that sort of thing. And Byrd writes that he understood that the church had recently just burned down. So this is about 1732. There's, again, a lot of murmurings around Spotswood of, what it was probably maybe burnt down unintentionally because people didn't want to travel so far to go to that particular church. All of these things happen by the end of the year. The county seat, which had been there, settled at Germanna, was moved east to Fredericksburg for the convenience of most people who were living in the county at that time. Again, the population was much more dense along the eastern edge of Spotsylvania County than the outer reaches of Germana, though it was beginning to grow. There still was a heavier population density on the eastern side, and they didn't want to travel so far for court days. In 1734, Spotsylvania County is reorganized to its present size now, and Orange County is formed in Germana. The home of Alexander Spotswood, namesake for Spotsylvania County, is no longer falls within his namesake county. For those of you who like maps, here's a little bit of map. It's kind of hard to see a little bit, but here's Spotsylvania County as it was organized, kind of its present boundaries extending to the Blue Ridge here. In 1734, that changes. You have Spotsylvania County sort of back to it, or down to its current size, and then Orange County, the current Orange County here, extends all that, out through the mountains as well during that time period. And again, as this movement west, as the settlement begins to move out into new lands, push out to new lands, the counties would then sort of consolidate into smaller portions, and then new large counties would be built beyond those. That just sort of was the process, and that's sort of how Germana and Spotsylvania County were tied for a short period. All right. So let me talk a little bit about the archaeology and what we're hoping to learn about this court town. So here's an overhead shot. Down here in the bottom left corner is the bridge over the Route 3 bridge over the Rapidan River. And here, marked in red, is approximately the foundations locations of Spotswood's Enchanted Castle, as we know about it. Now, that was begun built in 1720. Soon afterwards, Spotswood named Germana to be county seat. To be county seat, what requires that there be public buildings, including a courthouse. There needed to be a church. There needs to be a jail. There needs to be a pillory, someplace for I guess sort of punishments to be doled out. In addition, though, there's other buildings. There needs to be an ordinary, so people who are coming to court days have a place to, find a place to get a meal and a place to maybe stay overnight. All of those buildings were somewhere in this area. We believe that they're kind of located in this area here, between the Enchanted Castle and down here. This is where the original Germanna Ford was located, and is also sort of where the ferry landing was. So we believe that much of that town that was built up kind of occurred in this area. And today, when you walk through the woods, you can see mounds and things that are out there, which get us archaeologists really excited. We're kind of dying to be able to get in there and look, but there's so much out there right now that literally it's gonna take quite a while for us to gain a better understanding of sort of how this town was laid out. But that's the goal. We're trying to work towards that. We just have to have patience and keep plugging away. So we're interested in this area. So let me go on here. This is a LiDAR image. So everybody's heard of radar. Rather than using sound and bouncing off and learning about the images from the sound bounces, this is using light to fly over. We're able to sort of broadcast little light beams, and enough of them happen that they bounce off the trees and bounce back up and are recollected, and they also sort of go through the leaves of the trees and bounce off the ground. With that, you can actually sort of filter out the canopy, the tree canopy. Let me go back. You can see how much of our views are obscured by the tree foliage around here. And I think this is even a shot that was taken near the wintertime. The LiDAR sort of is able to filter that out, and you get a sort of a direct sense of what the actual ground looks like. So let me orient you here a little bit. This is the Route 3 bridge over the Rapidan. This is the area approximately around where the Germanna Ford was located. And this small little squiggle here is a road cut that's been there for a very long time, leading from the river up towards this bluff here. Now over here, marked with B, that's the location, that's the platform that was built for the Enchanted Castle. So what I want you to think about or notice is these little bumps that are sort of located in between the Enchanted Castle and the roadway here. Those are all possible buildings or things that need to be explored in future. And that's what we're hoping to learn a little bit more about. What did the town of Germanna look like when it was county seat? I'm kind of fascinated. I recently was reading, I thought back to my history days a long time ago, and I remember reading Rhys Isaac's book, Transformation of Virginia. He described colonial Virginia's community as it revolved around its court days. The courthouses, he detailed, were often isolated brick structures standing at crossroads in the midst of woods or fields. They often stood out among a small complex of supporting structures, an ordinary, a lockup, perhaps a store. He quote from him, "It was a cluster of almost deserted buildings. Only when it came together did the scattered community attain full existence. In the monthly concourse at the courthouse, the male part of Virginia County society became visible to its members in a manner similar to that observed in the parish church." End quote. Court proceedings provided drama, litigations over boundaries and entitlements, property and land or possessions, but it also, the spectacle of court days drew out others for commerce, trade, gaming, and other entertainments. I specifically remember him talking about horse races and the thrills of horse races that often occurred during court days. So some days when I'm out there, maybe tired or hot from working, I sometimes try to imagine, well, where would the horses have run if we were out here at Germana? It's kind of fun to imagine. However, our first project goals have been sort of to look for those origins, to look for the fort, the first building that was out there. And don't worry, every time we dig for something, we encounter the other portions as well. So it's not like we're ignoring the Spotsylvania or the Spotsylvania County connection, but we are sort of targeting right now to try and understand the depth of settlement there. We're trying to look for the Fort Germanna, the Palisades Wall. So to do that, we're going to go back to some of the work that Mary Washington College did. They located in this little L here formed by the two hyphens, what they noted was a small stain in the ground running diagonally, kind of towards the northeast and to the southwest. This is what it looked like when they excavated. It's just a stain in the ground. When they began to remove those stained soils from the natural soils next to it, they started to see other stains. And these are the stains left over from split wood that it was buried in this deeper trench. Here's where they began to see at the surface the beginnings of sort of the stains left over from the rotted wood. And then here they've excavated clear down to the bottom. So they get a sense about how deep it is. It's about 2.5 feet deep with these stakes sort of lined up in it. This is kind of characteristic of a wooden palisade. So this is, they found enticing. What's most interesting is that they found that this trench ran underneath the Enchanted Castle buildings. One thing about archaeology is that usually when you encounter something below another object, if you know one thing about it, you know that the one that's lowest is often older than the one above, because that's just the way that things naturally, most of the time, accumulate. So it was all very good possibility that this small little section that they had found was maybe telling us where the actual fort was located. Unfortunately, they found it in 1992. They did a little bit more testing. They didn't find any more evidence for the wall continuing, and the project ran out of funding in 1995. And again, for 20 years, nothing was happening, or nothing was able to happen out there at the site. So we've made it part of our goals to try and see if we can pick up that search for more of the fort walls and learn a little bit more about the fort. So in 2016, we finally were able to sort of set up ourselves to be able to begin excavations. We partnered with the Virginia Commonwealth University and Dr. Bernard Means to hold a field school out there for his class. And they actually get to work at the site and help us excavate and search for the fort. So what we did is we took that small little section that was known and we extended it out, possibly, to different directions, to the north and to the south. And we then started placing these small little squares that you see here are our test units. And our hope is that we would, in extending out, we would be able to intersect with the fort and find more of it. Once we understood where it was starting to go, we could then follow it to a corner. Right now, we have no idea whether that fort, so here's the small little section that's known. We don't know if this portion over here is inside of the fort or outside of the fort, or if this is the inside of the fort. It's completely unknown when we have just one small line. So we're hoping to find more of that line and then find a corner. If it turns, that will tell us which direction the fort is oriented. So there's a lot of information to be gained in doing that. We excavated here to the north, and we've quickly found that we were in the middle of a septic drain field that was put in place in around the 1980. They were very kind. They avoided the ruins, but they basically put the drain field all the way in front of the Enchanted Castle. So we stopped digging there because it had already been impacted, and we concentrated our efforts to the south. Unfortunately, we didn't find any more evidence of the Palisade Trench. Yeah, that's kind of where we were hoping. This area down here was kind of where we were hoping we might intersect it, but then we began to branch out and see if we could intersect it other places as well. This is our field crew from that year. There's staff, there's an assistant and several interns who were part of that, but then there's also the field school students as well. There's some of our day out working. We found some plowed areas, and that's some of the fine work that they did in sort of recovering that. And we also found artifacts that are very appropriate to the time. Here's a piece of slate with a little bit of a punch out for a nail hole. This is actually part of a slate roofing tile that would have been atop the Enchanted Castle. This is a small tobacco pipe stem. There's a hand-wrought nail there. This is a very appropriately aged rim sherd of a large platter. Probably, I'm making a gesture, but probably as big as like 16 or 18 inches wide is what it seems to be, given the little bit of diameter that we can read from the rim here. And then lastly, it's interesting, there's a little piece of window lead here. Those were the little pieces of window that are little pieces of lead that would be cushions on the edges of the window pane glass that were found. All things that are appropriate to the Enchanted Castle era, and also maybe to the Spotsylvania County era, community or courthouse era as well. So we're finding the right materials, but we didn't find the bit of the Palisade Trench that we were looking for. Went back in 2017. This is our crew again. We found a trench. We were very interested in it, but when we got to the bottom of the trench, it was actually modern utility. However, on another area of the site, they actually found, you see a little small wall here. We actually found a brand new building that was unknown. So, could be part of the Enchanted Castle complex, or it could be part of the larger town of Germanna at that time. But you can see here, there's 1, 2, 3 corners of a small 12-foot by 12-foot buildings with brick and stone foundation right there. So that was rather exciting. 2018, we decided to dig closer to the Enchanted Castle. We actually dug right up against a small bit of the front walkway, and that's the walkway in place. You can see the herringbone pattern with a little guard course of bricks over top of that, all of that in its original place. And then some of the fun that we had during, with our open houses and that sort of thing during that time. To talk a little bit more about it, let's talk about the picture on the left here. This is again another view of that walkway. Above the walkway surface itself, there was a pile of brick rubble, and there was literally thousands of fragments of brick, thousands of pounds of brick that had accumulated and been piled up over top of the foot the footings of the old building, the ruins. This had a mixture of materials in it, some of it dating into the 19th century. What we believe this is just a consolidation of the ruins that was probably undertaken by the Gordon family, the next large occupants of the property. They probably recovered as many materials as they could and then pushed all the rest into a pile over top of the ruins and then leveled it off, and so that they were able to live with that. We learned a lot by going through all these bricks, though, including we found, this is not the greatest picture to see, but this gray brick here is a glazed brick. We actually found a lot of glazed brick, and glazed brick in colonial times could have been used for specialized purposes. A lot of times they would use it as a decoration. If you put that into the pattern of the brick, sometimes you would have sort of these glinting facades of your building. We don't understand how these glazed bricks were used by Spotswood in the Enchanted Castle, but it just lets us know that, hey, there's more detail going on here than originally met our eye. A second unit nearby this unit, notice right here, one of the students was digging around this brick. Now, you can see, sometimes you see so much brick that it's hard to get excited about something like that. I didn't know why they were being so careful around it, but it turns out it ended up being an interesting brick. So here's a picture of it right there below that. That's the actual brick. And let me sort of turn it around so you can see at the side. What's interesting about this brick is its shape. It's actually got a bit of a wedge shape to it. And what we realize is that this is a specialized brick. Bricks are made by hand. Wet clay is forced into a wooden mold. The mold is then emptied and the clay is left to dry. When it's kind of leather dry, then they would sort of stack them up and fire them to heat. Well, this particular brick, this wedge-shaped brick, was not the normal brick. It wasn't the normal mold. It was a specialized brick. Again, somebody had to go to extra effort to create a brick like this. And here's maybe a little understanding as to why. We take the brick, and then we started stacking them next to each other. And in the time that it takes to go from vertical to horizontal, that covers about 14 inches of space. So if you do a mirror on both sides, that means you can create an archway with a brick like that in about 28 to 30 inches, which is normal for a window opening or even kind of a narrow door. So here again, the bricks that are surrounding us are sort of telling us a little bit of the detail about what the Enchanted Castle may have looked like, or how well it was constructed during the time period. But in addition to that, this is another end of that same trench. We found a little small refuse pit here, and we found the top of a wine bottle. There's a tobacco pipe that was found. To the right here is a cow's rib that showed some butcher marks, so probably left from someone's dinner. There's a small buckle. And then the sawn tip of a cattle's horn, which I don't know whether that's there for craft or if that's there for animal husbandry, but it's an interesting little piece that was found. So we're finding all this great material with which to work. We're collecting it, and that's going to become part of the database that we'll work with as the project continues to try and learn more about the daily lives of the people who lived out here during the different time periods that we can recognize. All right, so in 2019, something big happened, something very special to us. We were very generously gifted a building for us to house our archaeology program. The HIT Archaeology Center is built there on the campus next to the Visitor Center today. And in that building, we were able to wash the artifacts that we recover. We're able to lay them out and catalog and identify and count and weigh and do analysis on all the materials that we have. And perhaps most importantly, we also have lots of climate-controlled storage space, so that over the years, as we continue doing this archaeology, that we can create this archaeological database of artifacts and of documents that future scholars can kind of come to and ask questions about this frontier settlement. This is kind of a unique and an exciting experiment that we're undertaking. This building is an important tool for us to be able to do that. So that was really an exciting moment for us when we were able to open up that building and start using it in 2019. Right. Here I am to 2020. I'm not going to go too much longer. Here we are to 2020. All these little squares here are all the different units, excavations that we've done over the last 4 years. The white ones here are things that we tackled here in 2020. Kind of interest down here, it's hard to see. I just highlighted a little bit, but this little block in this area right here is on the edge of that terrace, that raised level area that Spotswood built the Enchanted Castle on. He also changed the landscape. So he built this edge up. So between here where the units are and here below that is about a 4.5-foot drop, very steep. We have to climb it every day that we're out there working. Spotswood changed the landscape, literally built up this large terrace here. And we've been excavating now over the summer to try to learn a little bit more. And we're finding something kind of interesting where we thought at first, we just found a small little bit of artifacts and places, objects left over from people, and then it kind of went to the natural soils. When we dug further down below that, we realized that some things that looked like natural soils were covering over. Spotswood had, again, building up that terrace. He had covered over the original ground surface. So we actually feel like in this summer, we've located a ground surface that dates to before the Enchanted Castle. And in addition, we found that there's sort of land features going on. I don't know if you can kind of see these stains here. Those are we don't know what it is yet. It's kind of hard to get to because we have to do a lot of digging through that 4 feet to get to it. But we're going to continue building on this, and we're going to figure out whether this is some sort of cellar feature or a refuse pit or something like that. We're going to try and sort of explore this a little bit further, but this is exciting because it's potentially is older than the Enchanted Castle, so before 1720. So that was kind of fun. Even in the days of COVID, we were much smaller. We didn't hold the field school this year. We just worked with our interns and then our regular staff. But we were able to sort of open up this new area and sort of get some new big questions. So we're excited to be able to try and see if we can continue pursuing this question and maybe learn a little bit more about how this landscape has been changed by Spotswood, by the Germans who first settled the area, and then ultimately, can we have an understanding about how the land was used before the Germans got there? All of it is rather exciting, and so like I said, we're building this database with which we can sort of start asking these big questions about Virginia's second century. This is a great place to talk about Virginia expanding into its Piedmont, all the things that need to happen to be able to do that. They could no longer rely on those river systems, so they had to create roadways and other ways of sort of moving goods and services around. There's a growth in a need for labor and a subsequent growth in the number of enslaved people in Virginia and being worked in Virginia. That is something that we can sort of look and see here at Germana as well. Lots of exciting questions that we're hoping to be able to look at through this larger Germana laboratory. And then lastly, I just kind of want to share with you, this is pre-COVID open house pictures. I'm sorry, I don't have our pictures from our last one. We did an open house and we had time tickets. Everyone wore masks. We spread things out and kind of had no-touch activities as best we could. And it was actually pretty successful. If you want to keep an eye on things that are going there, you can watch us through social media. Ashley mentioned Germanna.org as our website. We also have Germana Archaeology Instagram and Facebook and other social media feeds. But if you want to come and visit sometime, right now we're not able to open to the public because we're just figuring out where we are. We're hoping to build to a point where we can create better public access. but we do try to periodically hold open houses so that people can come in and see and ask questions and catch up with what we're doing. So keep an eye out for those in the future. We're hoping to do more of that. The students, when they're around to participate in it, really enjoy being able to share all that they've learned and experienced. And it ends up being a rather exciting time for all of us. And with that, those are all our people that have helped us so far. I just wanted to say thank you to all of you.
Well, that was great. Thank you to both of you. Really, really fascinating information.
It was fun.
Yeah, fun hearing you. We do have a couple questions that came through in the comments over your last couple presentations. So the first one we have is, where can I find more information about the Native American tension with Germana settlers?
That's a good question. So what's interesting, I mentioned about the Manahoac were said to have lived in the area. By the time the Germans and Spotswood were going out there in 1713, 1714 to build the fort, the Manahoacs didn't have a big presence out in the area any longer. So there's a lot of question that archaeologists have been asking for a long time of what happened to the Manahoacs, and that's still out there. There's a lot of other tribes around, like the Monacans and the Saponi and other tribes that are sort of related to the Manahoac. So in all likelihood, there's perhaps some kinship ties and language ties that sort of allowed them to sort of group together. That's a story that we'd like to explore further. We're going to have to look for some different sites, though. We're going to have to look for earlier sites to learn a little bit more about the Manahoac, and then also maybe doing some different types of documentary research to maybe learn a little bit about these other connections between tribes. And then lastly, we actually need to talk to Virginia Indians and find out what do they know, because they actually it's more their story than ours as archaeologists. I'm good at looking at things in the ground. There's a lot of different ways of knowing than just looking at objects from the earth. So that's a great question, and we hope we can be a place where people will feel comfortable to come and ask those questions. Maybe we can help connect people. We want to learn more about this, but maybe we can also help people connect to maybe we can all find out these answers together.
That's great. Here's another question that will be a little challenging. So, I'm sorry about that. Okay.
It happens.
Oh, no, you're right. So, the questioner asks about books on the history of early Spotsylvania. She says she owns one called Forgotten Companions and an early history of early Spotsylvania. Are you aware of other books that you can recommend?
I actually have, that's Paula Felder's book. I actually have it right here next to me in case I needed it. There are some other ones out there, but for some reason that one is, for Spotsylvania County, is a really good go-to book that I can think of right off the top of my head. There's other sort of more regional books. Some of them are looking at Orange County, and so I sometimes get them jumbled in my mind. Oftentimes their origin stories all kind of go back to that original Fort Germanna story. So that's why off the top of my head, I can't. What I can do is maybe I can send you something, Tracy. I can send you a list of some books when I get back to my office tomorrow.
That would be wonderful. And I can come back to maybe this feed or reach out to the person who asked specifically and email her back.
Good.
Yeah, and we do have a lot of books in our library. We do have a genealogy library at Germana, but we also have a lot of local and regional history books.
That's right.
And so I can check that out as well and get back to you as well on that information.
Great. And we have our own Virginiana collection in our Fredericksburg branch, which is in downtown Fredericksburg.
Yes.
And our Virginiana room manager, Nancy Moore, knows her collection inside and out, and so she may have some resources to point to as well.
I'm sure there's great ones there.
Yeah. Okay, so I know there's at least one other question. Let me scroll through the comments here. Okay, so Robert Taylor asks, Dr. Larsen, is it true that the Enchanted Castle was destroyed by fire in the 1750s? Was there servants' quarters, housing structures for the laborers for the 80,000 acres?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. It's a beautiful large house, and it's sort of astounding that it's completely disappeared and fallen off the maps and also out of memory.
Yeah.
What I understand from the archaeology before Carrie Burrell's work, Dr. Burrell's work, has kind of come to the conclusion that they believe that yes, it did burn down around 1750. Probably a lot of the masonry walls still stood up, but the timbers that supported the interiors all burnt out. So it was really unlivable after that point. There wasn't a lot of use of the house anyway. Alexander Spotswood was actually heading out. He was appointed general, and he was going to lead American forces in the new war with Spain. And he was in Annapolis, Maryland, collecting men and material, and passed away before he got on the boat and headed out. He died in 1740. His wife, Butler Brain, believe they think maybe lived on in the Enchanted Castle for a few more years, but then she remarried the local parish minister, Ashley.
John Thompson,
John
Reverend
Thompson, thank you. I just lost it at that second. And they lived they lived probably around the parish for a while, but then built a house together that's also connected with the foundation, the house at Salubria in near Culpeper in Stevensburg area of Virginia. So she and her family sort of moved away. His son then became the owner of the property, but I don't think he chose to live at Germanna. So he lived in Newpost, I believe. And so the house largely sat empty. So it seems that there wasn't much in it. Archaeologists didn't find a lot of daily material, things that you would expect to be in a living, vital household. They're really probably the only people who were living there were the servants who were kind of keeping up the house. But we don't have a lot of detail about their life or whether they were living in the house or whether there were quarters outside of the house. Maybe as we expand now, so we've chosen Mary Washington did a wonderful job of sort of testing and sampling the Enchanted Castle building itself. We're starting to push out into the landscape further so that maybe we can locate quarters and other dependencies, buildings that are around there. We also want to find the courthouse. We also want to find the church and the other, the tavern, the ordinary would also be great to find. We're hoping to sort of get a little bit wider picture, and maybe we'll learn a little bit more about what happened to the Enchanted Castle from that.
That's great. Thank you so much. So I don't have any other questions in the feed. If anybody has any more questions, now is a good time to put them in the comments.
One thing I do want to mention that I failed to mention in my presentation, we talk about how wooded the area is and how it is wooded today. When the first group settled in 1714, they were there to do mining. However, the first 2 years they were at the fort, they had to clear the land for farming. So from 1714 to 1716, roughly, they were just farming the land. They didn't do any mining. And I think it's the January presentation that we have someone doing iron mining in Spotsylvania County. So there may be some really good information from that presentation too on that topic.
Sounds interesting.
I'm kind of fascinated. There's a real difference between the fort, and then the fort was only there for a very short period of time, maybe 6 years. But there's a very big difference between life in a fort. That, to build the fort, you need axes. You need to be able to split the wood into the long pails, the stakes that were then in the ground. Most of their lives would have been sort of based around simple tools, broad axes for hewing, saws for cutting. when we get to the beginnings of building the Enchanted Castle and then the larger community, the public buildings for the courthouse, the landscape is transformed. We see brick fragments everywhere from that time period. So there's tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of bricks that are being created on site. Mm-hmm. The clays are mined locally, they're formed on site, they're fired on site, and then they're built into these structures. There must have been saw pits for cutting regular lumber, not just axe work, or hewing work, but there must have been a real transformation of trades and labor that occurred all around that place in a very short period of time, from 1714 to about 1720, and then from 1720 through 1750. Germanna was very different. It was, I don't want to say it was bustling, but there was a lot of work going on to be able to build all that. And that, I think about not just, who created it, but well, it is who created it. It's the labor, it's the hands. Mm-hmm. When we dug through 4 feet of fill that was redeposited from somewhere else, I can't help but think about, boy, it's hard just to dig this small little 5x5 square that we're digging. I would hate to have to create this whole field, so start to think about labor and how people transform the landscape. There's a lot of sort of really heavy, weighty, interesting questions that kind of come through that.
Right.
Yeah. So I do have 2 more questions that came through. When did the name change from Spotswood to Spotswood? That's the first question.
Off the top of my head, I don't think I can say.
Yeah, I don't know either. I mean, a lot of the times when you have families coming over, immigrants coming over, like the Germans, a lot of the German surnames were anglicized once they got here. So Spotswood may have changed it from Spottiswood to Spotswood. But I don't really know the exact timing of that change. I think there's a lot of documents in Williamsburg that have Spotswood signatures on it. I'm not sure how many have Spottiswood, but Spotswood, I think, is the most common use of the surname you'll see on documents here in the States. Oh, and Tracy's muted.
Okay, let me try this.
There we go.
So are there social media accounts you had mentioned before for either of you or the work you're doing, or should people just follow the Germanna Foundation accounts?
Well, for Germanna itself, we have Germanna Foundation here on Facebook, and then I solely run the Instagram account, so Germanna_Foundation. There is a LinkedIn page as well that our executive director, Tim Sutphin, will post things in occasionally. We do have a Twitter page. We don't use it a whole lot, but as far as our social media streams, Facebook is the main place to go, especially for events. Typically, if Germanna is having an event, we'll post it there. And then, especially if it's archaeology related, Eric can share it to his page, and I'll let him talk about the 2 pages he runs.
Yeah, we run parallel pages, though cross-reference time. So going to the website is a good way probably to get all of them. But our handles are Germana Archaeology for both Facebook and for Instagram. I think Instagram is Germanna_Archaeology, and with Facebook it's just Germanna Archaeology, or sort of the easy ways to get it. We're similar with Twitter. Again, we've just not gotten the Twitter bug. Our work is too slow.
Yeah, the
to be updated for Twitter. I haven't figured out how to make archaeology. My colleagues can, but I haven't figured out how to make archaeology work on Twitter.
And ever since COVID happened, one of my goals personally at the beginning of the year was to do more videos at Germanna. And so when March hit, basically we've done probably about 30 videos this year. We started off as called 5 Minutes with Germanna. Initially it was meant to be sort of like a once, maybe a month type of thing. And we did several once a week. And so you can actually find a lot of those on our Facebook page or the website. And we even have a YouTube channel. I should mention that. We have a lot of pages or a lot of videos for the past. I did a presentation at the Salem Church branch in October of 2017, all about Germana. I go a lot further in depth than I did today. You'll find some things about archaeology on there too. There's a lot of great information.
That's wonderful. Yeah, thank you both for taking the time tonight to speak to us and to kick off the first, the Spotsylvania 300 lecture series. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, they'll be going on the first Thursday of every month from 6:30 to 8, all through the next year. For the time being, they'll all be on Facebook Live. I don't know when we'll get to do in person again, but thankfully, this is a way for everybody to join, no matter where you are. And then you can also check out the Spotsylvania County website, spotsylvania.va.us, for other upcoming events to celebrate the Spotsylvania 300th anniversary. So, Ms. Abruzzo and Dr. Larsen, thank you so much.
Thank you for having
This has
us.
been a lot of
This
fun.
is great.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a great
you.
night, everybody.
You too.